I just painted a Botticelli study. Let's see how it turned out. I was working from Botticelli's Madonna and Child from 1490. This is actually my second time trying to copy a Botticelli. What happened the first time? For my first Botticelli painting, I found a supposed description of his technique on Artinet. I tried following the directions, and I painted the skin transparently as suggested. It came out looking like watercolor, which is a cool effect, but it didn't really look like a Botticelli. I resolved to study more and try again. Botticelli was painting in the 15th century, and he was known for his depictions of mythology and the Virgin Mary. Although Botticelli is considered a Renaissance painter, he worked in a tradition of egg tempera painting, which came from the Gothic period, influenced by Byzantine iconography. Egg tempera is a type of paint where you mix pigment into egg yolk. We actually know a lot about Gothic painting techniques. Artists of the time would paint thin lines called hatching to make blending effects, because egg tempera dries very quickly and you can't blend it on the surface. The painter Cennino Cennini wrote a book in the 1390s, where he described the technique for painting people, a green underpainting called verdaccio, followed by 3 layers of lighter and lighter skin tones. I decided to try copying some egg tempera paintings from the Gothic period in acrylic, using Cennino Cennini's method and hashing. In my previous painting, I had used acrylic like watercolor, and it looked wrong. But I still believed that acrylic could be used to copy an egg tempera painting. Acrylic is very close to egg tempera in handling qualities, such as being water-based, waterproof, and fast-drying. Acrylic is more similar to egg tempera than oils, watercolor, or gouache. So acrylic seemed like it would be a good candidate to copy the layered hatching techniques of the Gothic and early Renaissance. My first attempt at Gothic painting was a study of a Madonna by Duccio, and it went badly. I was trying to hatch by laying down long, thick strokes. My skin tones had an overly salmon pink shade. What was wrong? Was it the fault of acrylic? Or was something wrong with my technique? I made a breakthrough from watching the YouTube channel Painting the Light, which showcases many Gothic and Renaissance studies. The painter, Antonis, mentioned the importance of painting on the tip of your brush for hatching.
As you see, I'm using the tip of my brush. It's very important.
I realized that this was the piece that I was missing. To paint on the tip of my brush, I needed to switch to a brush with a finer point. Also, I needed to dilute the acrylic a little bit with water, because acrylic is thicker and stickier than egg tempera. After making this adjustment, I started getting better results in my master studies of Fra Angelico and Ghirlandaio. I was able to get thinner strokes and build up volume. My hatching technique improved. With this experience, I was ready to come back to Botticelli and try to make a better copy of his work. I found a Botticelli painting with a high-res photo available on Google Arts and Culture, which lets you zoom in. A good quality reference is really helpful during master studies. I inked the lines in my pencil drawing. I started painting with the sky first because it's behind everything. Botticelli would have likely used azurite, a bluish-green pigment. I initially tried mixing the sky blue with ultramarine blue and yellow, but I realized that I would need a greener blue, so I added in some phthalo blue to match the azurite hue. I painted a base coat. To make the gradient, I used horizontal hatching on top of dry layers. For the mantle, I used a gray base coat. I chose gray because I noticed gray peeking through underneath the blue when I zoomed in on a damage area. The base tones for the shirt and hair were red and brown. According to a paper on Botticelli's technique, Botticelli would leave his imprimatura, the base tone layer, visible in the reflected light areas of the skin. I zoomed in on that area in the photo to find the base tone in the gaps between the hatching. I observed that Botticelli had used a greenish yellow ochre tone. According to Cennino Cennini, you can mix a verdaccio from yellow ochre, black, and white. Yellow ochre shifts towards green when mixed with black. I only used a tiny bit of black because Botticelli's verdaccio was very light, and I used titanium white instead of lead white. I applied 2 thin layers for the verdaccio. I mixed up red, yellow ochre, and a little bit of white for the red of the cheeks. I added plenty of yellow ochre because if you mix red and white together, you get a tone that's too cool. I've used egg tempera before. You mix the pigment with an appropriate amount of water and egg yolk, which is called tempering. The acrylic paints I was using, which are golden open acrylics, are thicker and stickier than egg tempera, so I diluted the acrylic with a little bit of water. Then I wiped out some of the paint onto a paper towel. I used a brush with a very fine point and painted on the tip of the brush. These were some of the tricks that I had learned for hatching. I mixed 4 flesh tones. 3 flesh tones of varying lightness as described by Cennini, plus a darker shadow tone on the left. When I examined Botticelli's painting, I noticed that his verdaccio was too light to be a shadow tone, around a 6 out of 10 on the value scale. Botticelli didn't use this lighter verdaccio as a shadow tone, he used it for the reflected light at the far edge of the shadow. For the shadows, Botticelli used a darker shadow tone, like a 4 or a 5, and covered the verdaccio with it. The lightest flesh tone was around a 7.5. I mixed slightly lighter because any mix with white dries darker in acrylic, and also in egg tempera. Now I'm going to show you the wrong way to do hatching, which is to take undiluted paint and then plop it onto the surface in a thick line with the side of the brush. Another wrong way is to dilute the paint a lot without wiping any of it out. If there's too much liquid in the brush, you can't hatch thin lines. The right way is to use just a little bit of water and then wipe off some of the extra paint with a paper towel. Then you can get the thin lines. Think of it like you are batting at the surface with the tip of the brush. I hatched the shadow tone in the shadow areas. Then I moved on to the 3rd lightest tone and overlapped the shadow areas. Hatching the 2nd lightest tone. Hatching the lightest tone. At this point, the skin was far away from Botticelli's smooth finish. But I learned something from my recent paintings with hatching. When in doubt, add more layers. Before finishing the skin, I needed to render the features. It's difficult to work on the face when you're dancing around unfinished eyes and lips. Botticelli was not a naturalistic painter, and his features were very stylized and outlined. The way to paint outlined features is to paint the features first and the outlines last. As an example, if you paint the outlines of the eyelids first, then it's hard to paint the eyelids without painting over those outlines. If you paint the eyelashes first, then it's hard to paint the whites of the eyes without disturbing the eyelashes. Instead, paint the features first and put dark outlines over them. When mixing the color for the lips, I used plenty of yellow ochre to avoid a bright red lipstick effect. The process for the lips was the same as the eyes. I modeled them from dark to light. Then I painted the outline in between the lips. Now that the eyes and lips were done, it was time to go back to rendering the face. My goal was to smooth out all the transitions that had rough hatching. Unlike earlier Gothic artists, Botticelli did so much modeling that his hatching was barely visible. I believe that he was still using hatching, he just used many layers. In the Gothic technique described by Cennini, there were 3 flesh tones. I added a 4th shadow tone from the beginning. Eventually, I mixed up some additional intermediate tones in between those 4 tones. There's no rule saying that you can only use 3. And using more tones was helpful to smooth out the transitions. So I would not be surprised if Botticelli used more than 4 skin tones. The flesh was modeled using the same hatching technique as before, just more and more layers. Nearly every area of the face received at least 1 more pass. According to my notes, it took around 13 hours total to model the face, nose, and neck, and 3 hours for the eyes and lips. In this video, you're seeing highlights from the process that are sped up. However, I've shown you how the hatching works, and that was the only technique I used. It's a simple technique. You get the smoothness from doing lots of layers and allowing it to dry in between. The shirt was painted from dark to light. I was using a bright red pigment called Pyrrole Red, and I toned it down by adding yellow ochre. I re-established the outlines for the folds of the cloth. I finished the shirt with a glaze of Pyrrole Red mixed with black, because I felt it was too light. The medium was golden gloss glazing liquid. I don't know if glazes were used by Botticelli, but they were used in this time period, especially on clothing. In retrospect, I didn't need this glaze, and my shirt turned out darker than the reference. Botticelli loved to make detailed clothing. The shirt had a beautiful lace trim. I outlined it in titanium white, mixing in a little bit of burnt umber and black for the shadowed area. The lace was a repeated crisscross pattern. On the upper side, there was a pattern of 3 dots. For the mantle, I started by filling in the shadow areas. Then I went with a grayish-blue underpainting. When I examined the mantle close up, I thought that I saw a grayish-blue peeking through. I don't know if Botticelli used this technique, but gray or azurite underpaintings for blue garments were common in the Renaissance. Ultramarine blue was saved for a later glazing step. I built up the ultramarine glaze in several layers, and I used a hairdryer to ensure that each layer was dry. When I felt that the mantle was getting too dark and losing the light areas, then I hatched a lighter layer on top and returned to glazing. In retrospect, my glazes became more intense than in the reference. Matching colors is hard. I pre-mixed a color string for the hair using burnt umber, Pyrrole Red, and yellow ochre, along with black and white. At this point, I assessed what the hair needed. it was a little bit too reddish-orange because of the underlayer showing through. It was popular in the Gothic and Renaissance to give the Virgin Mary red hair, but Botticelli wasn't going quite so red in this piece. Also, the hair was very streaky in some places, especially the darks. The earth tones I was using aren't fully opaque. In egg tempera and acrylic, unlike oils, you're typically using thin layers that don't fully cover what's underneath. This causes the lighter areas to not be light enough. I needed to build up more layers to fix these issues. I remixed my colors to be less orange, and I added some more dark tones. I built up full coverage off camera. With the structure of the hair complete, I was ready to start painting the hair details. Remember, to get thin lines with acrylic, you may have to dilute with a little bit of water. I also switched to a smaller brush. With the hair complete, it was time for the translucent white veil. Botticelli often gave the Virgin Mary a lace veil. The technique for the veil was to add a little bit of burnt umber to the white to make it less cold, and then wipe out some of the paint. It took me a couple tries to remember how much to wipe out. I used a second brush that was dry to clean up the edges of the lines. I switched to a slightly less pointy brush, and it made the lines easier. I hatched the lace trim. I mixed burnt umber with black and a little bit of water for a shadow tone. Then I painted the shadows of the veil transparently as a glaze. I drew the halo on top of tracing paper. Then I transferred it to the painting. You can see very faint graphite outlines. You don't want to just freehand a halo. Note that in my paint mix, I dulled and warmed up the yellow. We're painting it over blue, so we don't want it to come off overly greenish. After painting the outline, I hatched in the shading. And now, we're done. Let's compare to the original. I did my own underdrawing without using tracing, and I tweaked the proportions and features according to my taste. For instance, I made the eyes more symmetrical. There are also some differences in the colors. The original has yellowish flesh, which I interpreted as a color cast on the reference, so my flesh tones are a bit warmer. As for the clothing, the red shirt ended up a bit darker, and the blue mantle ended up brighter, but I didn't see a reason to mess around with them any further. You can see areas where I reserved the verdaccio for the reflected light in the shadows. And if you zoom in, you can see a little bit of the verdaccio showing through in between the hatching, which Botticelli also did. I'm happier with this Botticelli study than I was with my previous one. The difference is technique. Estimated painting time was around 44 hours, not counting cleanup and video setup. Thanks YouTube for the strong positive reception to my first video. It inspired me to make this second video. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Thank you for watching.